So thanks so much for joining me, Shobna, for this chat. Everybody's calling it unprecedented times, uncharted territories, but sometimes it almost feels like a big social experiment, right? And we've never been confined to our homes. We were never restricted to what we took so much for granted. So, wanted to speak to you and seek your opinion. What's the new normal?
Yeah, thank you, Nirud. Really looking forward to this conversation. And who thought we'd be doing this by Skype, right? Yes, that's a good question. So, what is the new norm, right? And I think at a individual, community, and a societal level, we are sort of trying to make sense of it. And I think this might be oversimplifying the new norm, but I think whether one wants to see it as a major disruption in
Yeah.
our personal and professional lives in the social, economic, and political realms, or one wants to just try and understand it from a purely scientific sort of perspective.
Yeah.
This, at the end of the day, is basically a pandemic that is like no other.
Yeah.
And I think, from my 80-year-old mom to my 20-year-old son and
Yeah.
me between, we all, agree we have never experienced something like this. So
Yeah.
I think the new norm, I think, is one about where everything we took for granted and everything we thought we knew is
Yeah.
basically being challenged. And it's needing us to rethink a lot of things, including how we live our lives, how we pursue our careers, and how we basically work with people at a community and a global level to deal with all kinds of challenges that humanity faces now and will face in the future too.
Teenagers who are currently in high school, undergrads, most of the employees in these educational institutes have not been through a life event like this. And you have done significant work in youth support, addressing domestic violence. In this new world where we are all confined in our homes, have you seen increase in number of people who are seeking help when it comes to domestic violence and mental health? And also, do you see educational institutes playing a bigger role than the usual agencies that they are, and doing more than what they've been doing over all these years, especially in the areas of domestic violence and mental health?
Right. I mean, there's a lot being talked about and written about the greatest economic slump of our times and the
Yes.
economic impact of COVID. Uh, I don't think there's enough being written about the social impacts of this pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think the shocking part is how, in less than 150 days of this pandemic disrupting our lives, domestic violence, child abuse, assaults, all kinds of social issues that we call, the wicked social issues,
Yeah.
they have all basically increased all over the world. From North America to the most remotest areas of the world, people are seeing an increased incidence of relationship violence and abuse and neglect. And that's, extremely concerning. But it comes as no surprise to those of us who are passionate about and who have worked in the fields of social sciences.
Yeah.
The reason is because relationship violence, for instance, whether you call it domestic violence or intimate partner violence, it's grounded in control and
Yeah.
fear.
Yeah.
And when you have a pandemic and people are basically homebound, the person who's the perpetrator of the violence now actually has more control over the other person who is at the receiving end of violence.
Yeah.
So it is no surprise that these numbers and the need has gone up. And different organizations, different countries, different educational institutions have responded, to this call for more supports and services. And I think we live in a country where we have access, even during times pre-COVID, we have access to a wide range of services, including online services and also therapeutic, interventions. What it has done now is to make sure that institutions and organizations make these supports and services also readily and easily available online. But the challenge is that somebody who is, say, in a domestic violence situation, right, where do they call from help if they are in 1,000 square feet of
Yes.
square footage, right? Even the most private portions of the house may not be private enough for you to make a call and say that you're not doing well.
Yeah,
Or if you're facing extreme anxiety or depression, it's very difficult to get up, pick up the phone, and call for help. So I
very.
think what COVID has done is to help us all realize individuals and groups that are vulnerable in good times are even more vulnerable during pandemics. And so, as a society, I think we need to continue to see how we can support and understand these issues better.
I was reading some articles, and in some parts of the country and across North America, some of these cases have spiked by almost 50%,
Yes.
which really puts a lot of pressure on supporting agencies to go out and have that outreach program in place, even
Yes.
like for anything that happens in future, not only today.
Oh, absolutely, Neeraj. And one of the things that is not often spoken about is vicarious trauma and caregiver burnout. So
Yes.
these individuals who are now reaching out and checking in on vulnerable populations, or they're going on a Skype call or a Zoom call or getting on a phone call to talk to their clients, they themselves are facing a lot of trauma and difficulties. The
Yes.
classic example is doctors and nurses, who are in the front lines dealing with COVID. I mean,
Yeah.
it's heart wrenching, some of the stories that we're
Yes.
hearing about from around the world. So while we think about how to help the vulnerable groups and individuals who have mental health or relationship violence issues, so important to also think about how do we support the professionals and the volunteers who are providing this critical support.
So, how would you describe the engagement of educational institutes with the communities they work in during this pandemic? And why is this community engagement so critical for some and not for others? And you have worked across the globe. Did you see some differences between how Canadian institutes engaged versus other parts of North America versus, say, a country far east like India?
Right. Yeah, this topic is close to my heart, of course, and the university that I'm part of now, Simon Fraser University, community engagement is
Yeah.
central to the mission of the organization. And there's such a diversity in how people have responded. So, for example, if you take SFU, right, we almost immediately rallied all our efforts and forces together, and we now have an SFU CAN. So it stands for COVID Action Now. And what we've done is bring together faculty, staff, students, volunteers to see how we can respond to the immediate needs of the institution and also the community and all the partners we work with, including government, nonprofits, faith groups and other groups. I've been talking to some of my friends and my ex-colleagues in India, and what's very interesting is that it has there has been a response to the COVID situation in a big way in the community engagement space, but a lot of it seems to be under the corporate social responsibility CSR banner. So you have large institutions, cutting a check and supporting organizations and the government through the relief funds to get help out there. But also, as we've seen with floods and fires and other, natural calamities, in countries like India, the volunteer base is now very active. And
Yes.
volunteers, like Canada, but in large numbers, are getting out there making sure, that people are fed, that medicines are delivered. And, information about COVID is explained in a way that makes sense to a very diverse and large population of over 1 billion people.
Yeah.
So I think there are some similarities. I think the goodness of people's hearts and the best in people are definitely coming out during these times, whether it's in an education institution in Canada or a
Yeah.
nonprofit in India. But I think what is also emerging is the how the demand for these things and the supply don't always match up.
Yeah.
And students are particularly vulnerable because you have around the world over 1 billion students now who are not in classrooms. And many of these young people, are sort of within their homes, and many of those homes may not be a safe place.
Yes.
So, an even greater need for, educational institutions, nonprofits, faith groups, governments to all come together to see how a wide range of support services and information can be made available through multiple channels so people don't feel even more isolated.
Big casualty of this pandemic is job losses, and it has happened across the globe. In this new world, do you foresee that the diversity dividend conversation will take a backseat, and will it be relevant, still stay relevant for private sector as well as public sector?
So at Simon Fraser University, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is a very high priority,
Yeah.
both for the current president and the incoming president. And we've done a lot of, deep dive into this topic at our institution. And I've been talking about this with a couple of my colleagues who are, working with me on the EDI portfolio. And what's very interesting is that, there's actually two schools of thoughts that's emerging. If you look at literature from around the world, some organizations, some governments, and some groups are really, really stepping up to the plate in a big way and making sure that we don't forget about diversity and inclusion, because a lot of groups actually get further marginalized
Yes.
and are at the receiving end of very racist, comments or, experiences during pandemics and other difficult times. There's another school of thought that believes that when resources are so tight, maybe this is not the time, to be investing in EDI, which I personally think is a huge problem and frankly a mistake, because it's taken us so many years to get EDI, sort of at the forefront of priorities, both at a societal and an institutional level. And you build it up in small increments. So now if you're going to put it in the back burner, right, when things get better post COVID, you're going to have to begin literally from scratch and start those conversations all over again. So I feel that it's really critical, that EDI, like other important, initiatives, needs to stay at the forefront. And if it is being put in the back burner, individuals and champions of EDI, need to raise, the concern and challenge it, because this is not the time for the diversity, dividend to be not recognized as an important part of the solution to make things better.
Yeah. Another thing that's happening and which will happen kind of on a large scale is a lot of experienced people would be available in this job market. So, in this post-COVID world, what do you think would be some of the biggest challenges and also prospects for the new grads and future of work, especially for them?
Absolutely. I think in the last decade, not just academics, but also I think, businesses, governments, and others have been talking about the future of work. And those conversations, became very critical, mainly because of the disruptions that we were all experiencing due to technological, changes and advances. Classic example, blockchain and fintech, for instance, right? So that led us all down the path of really thinking about and debating about the future of the financial industry and what
Yes.
does the digital economy mean for all of us. Then there are many professions that are no longer needed, and then there are others that are in huge demand. The example is, data scientist, right?
Yes.
10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, many universities didn't have courses,
Yes.
remotely connected to data sciences other than, say, a course in statistics, right?
Yes.
Whereas right now, because of demand, you have a lot of the good institutions, including SFU, that have undergraduate and graduate programs in, say, data sciences,
Yeah.
because you need data sciences for the future.
Yeah.
So within that context, I think when you think about the new grads, I mean, the first and most important thing I want to acknowledge is, how stressful, it must be for a lot of students who are finishing off university or who have just recently graduated. But one of the things I want to throw out there, and I'm an optimist by nature, so one of the things I want to throw out there is that, society at different points in time, have been challenged by one thing or the other. It could be diseases, it could be, technology, it could be national calamities. Just before COVID hit us all, the conversations were so much about climate change, and the climate change agenda was on top of everyone's mind.
Yes.
And then COVID basically took over, the climate change, agenda. So what I think is going to happen with my prediction for new graduates and students who are just finishing up studies is that, they will hopefully with support of mentors, professors, business folks and HR experts, including folks like yourself, Neeraj, will try to figure out what is their place in this new and changed world of ours. And, information and education that has been acquired, how could we use it, in the post-COVID world? The other thing which I'm already seeing is the number of students who are trying to be very creative and innovative and who are starting things on their own or who are sharing their expertise, for example, in making personal protective, equipment, from their basements or through a startup. So I think there'll be a lot of transformation, I
Yeah.
think, for the young graduates who are coming out of our institutions globally. But I think there also might be a bit of a globalization in the sense that young people across the world might partner to do some very unique things that's needed and that might help them, earn a livelihood as they move forward. But another prediction I have
Yeah.
is that I think the value of education,
Yeah.
might also go up. A lot of people who did not necessarily consider, going back to school or, taking a higher degree might
Yeah.
actually decide to do that to deepen their expertise or to basically use this time well in the pursuit of knowledge. So a number of things could come out of it. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what the future of work is post COVID.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like any other crisis, right? Like this will create some new opportunities as well, and will create a lot of opportunities for, especially for new grads and post grads to innovate.
Yes,
Do
absolutely.
yeah. So, on a personal note, how are you dealing with the current situation, and what are some key takeaways for you?
That's a good question. I love it. I think, like you said earlier, this came about so quickly.
Yeah.
It's like no other change or crisis or disruption, we have faced. For me, I think the first 2, 3 weeks was the hardest
Okay.
because there was so much of information we were all bombarded with, and a great deal of uncertainty and fear mongering that happened, not to mention false news. And all kinds of scary stuff was put out there.
Yeah.
But I think because, I'm part of an institution that is very community engaged, but also well connected, both internally and externally,
Yeah.
apart from my own family, I have such a strong support system and a safety net. So
Yeah.
I think for me personally, the disruption has been, I would say, minimal.
Yeah.
What is concerning is the future, and what it means for all of us, what it means for our, families and our, institutions. In terms of takeaways, Neeraj, I have to say the two big takeaways is that this has challenged me to really ask myself, what are my strengths and
Yes.
how do I leverage those strengths to stay sane, to be productive and to add value, not to just lives of those, I love and I'm responsible and I take care of, but
Yeah.
also how do I add value to the organization and the, that I'm part of, but also groups that I'm very involved with on a pro bono basis.
Yeah.
The second important takeaway for me is that, you know, at the end of the day, humanity is one race, and what happens to one, impacts the other.
Everybody.
And while we're all keeping social distancing and physical distancing, and we're all, in our own little homes, this has actually connected us globally in
Yeah.
ways that probably we didn't before. Like, I can't even think about the number of people I've connected with all around the world in the last 4 months compared to pre COVID. So I think the human connection, the value of relationships, always being there to lift someone's spirits up and to do the little you can, to basically make the world and our lives better. It has just become even more important, and
Yeah.
it's been really, really good reminder.
Okay. So, okay, so that's a very hopeful note. We can conclude our conversation here.
Thank you,
Thanks
Nick.
again. Thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated.